Greetings. This is Dr. Gordon Carkner, and I work with graduate students at University of British Columbia to support them in their faith and their academic studies and creative dialogue. So this question, this is one of several we hope to cover in this year, the year ahead. It's called, Why Do We Suffer? Does suffering stifle or support belief in a good God? Yes, of course, we all suffer, but why me? We often ask, why my loved ones? Here's a couple of interesting quotes. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in suffering. Friedrich Nietzsche. Without pain, there would be no suffering. Without suffering, we would never learn from our mistakes. Pain and suffering is the key to all windows. Without it, there would be no way of life. Angelina Jolie, actress. So suffering, as you know, is a complex phenomenon. It's intimidating to organize, to think about, to probe, and to cope with, really. So I think the bottom line here is that we actually need to choose a sound worldview in analyzing suffering and coping with suffering, or we suffer the consequences, so to speak. We reap the consequences. The stakes are actually quite high in terms of how we look at suffering. From what vantage point, from what outlook? As you know, suffering is one of the most existential questions for people of all worldviews. If we dig deep, we can think about it in a proper moral, spiritual worldview context. The problem of pain, human worth, and morality are entwined here. We will need all the resources of reason, imagination, and revelation to accomplish this task. Some background. Psychiatrist Scott Peck points out that most human neuroses start with the refusal to face the hard realities of life, to deal with pain and brokenness in healthy ways. Our mental health, he notes, comes via facing reality at all costs. Unhealth starts with a refusal to accept and go through one's pain, to grapple with the complexity of life and relationships. To be human, it would seem, is to suffer. But how do we suffer well? How do we suffer maturely? Let's be brave and face the hard truth of pain and suffering and the bigger picture, which is evil. We won't be focusing on evil in this talk particularly, but I've left a bibliography at the end to go into more detail. Philosopher Peter Kreeft claims that we need a robust worldview for discerning suffering. Many worldviews make things worse, he says, making our lives more miserable. This comes from his book, I think a very helpful starting book on this topic, Making Sense Out of Suffering. This is chapter 2. Some worldviews are actually quite deaf to our suffering, our cries in the night. So can we find in our suffering, can we find meaning in our suffering? This is a famous psychologist, Viktor Frankl, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He believes that we can and we must. Here's I quote, "If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete." As you know, Viktor Frankl suffered under quite an oppressive situation in Dachau and Auschwitz concentration camps, and he worked on some of his ideas while he was there. It was his anticipation of being reunited with his wife and of finishing his doctrine of logotherapy that kept him alive, actually. So one's worldview can handicap this natural human quest for meaning, this inherent need to have meaning in our suffering. If suffering is part of life, then we must have meaning in our suffering. Nihilism is the loss of meaning. Nihilism, a major outlook today, offers no discernment when it comes to good, evil, suffering, or injustice. It is a bit of a spiritual black hole regarding our higher purpose. I've written about this in my blog, and you can find it at this location. It cynically gives up on grace and majors on the tragic side of life. It can even lead, if taken to an extreme, to terrorism. many famous atheists believe in just this kind of hopelessness. You might remember the famous quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, "Man is an empty bubble on the sea of nothingness." Or you might have read something about Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who shook his fist in the face of God right to the very end. Or Macbeth from William Shakespeare, "Mankind is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." I want to turn to a Norwegian painter, Edvard Munch. And this painting shows the nihilistic angst and despair of today's world. I'm not going to analyze this painting. You can look up information on Wikipedia, but it's often seen as one of the archetypal paintings of the age of nihilism, the age of despair and angst. On the other side, on the positive side, David Brooks, who wrote the book, The Road to Character, and now this second book in the series, The Second Mountain, offers us hope that pain actually can do some positive things for us, that there is value in our pain. So we know that pain is real and it hurts, and most of us, of course, dislike it and would work hard to avoid it in our entire life. But suffering, like divorce, acts as a foghorn that blasts us out of our complacency. So says C.S. Lewis in The Problem of Pain. It can be a warning that we are disoriented, headed in the wrong direction, pursuing the wrong goals, out of touch with our emotions. Pleasure, on the other hand, wealth and ease, can put us to sleep spiritually. So pain can actually wake us up. Secondly, pain helps us see the true size of our egotistical desires, the falseness and shallowness of many of our ambitions, the egregiousness of our pride. It provides reality therapy, so to speak. When we are brought low from suffering, humility becomes possible, so we can assess the damage that either we are doing or someone else is doing to us. We can reorient our desires, recalibrate our priorities. In fact, at the end of the day, great pain is a key source of great art. We could point out several pieces of literature like Les Miserables, or art, or poetry, etc., that backs this up. Thirdly, suffering also shatters our illusion of autonomy and self-sufficiency, so that we can see the importance of the interdependent life, the communal life, the storied life. If connected to a larger narrative of change and redemption, it's possible to suffer our way to wisdom. And I suppose that would be part of the trajectory of this talk, where we want to head, to joy and wisdom. Next slide talks about how suffering teaches us about reality itself. Again, that aspect of waking us up to reality. In fact, we were never promised a world in which we would not suffer, in which there was no tragedy or loss. If you remember, your mother suffered for your very birth and experienced many sleepless nights during your teenage years. To live in love and be human is to suffer at some level, and for some of us, quite intensively and quite chronically. Things do go south despite our best efforts and intentions. We cause a lot of our own problems through thoughtlessness, naivety, or negligence. Life has built-in consequences that are inescapable, so there is a sense in which pain actually chastens us or disciplines us. Third, causing unnecessary suffering to others, I just want to put this out there, causing unnecessary suffering to others, especially to the innocent, vulnerable, and weak, is morally evil. Malevolence, racism, lies, bigotry, divisiveness, and violence are morally wrong and unjust. They are unacceptable. Narcissistic and sociopathic visiting of our neuroses, ego, and disappointment on others is not just dysfunctional, it's wrong. You know my stance on that point. Suffering is endemic to love as well. And I think that's important, that it's endemic to things we cherish. So says C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves. Suffering well for and with others deepens our character, makes us interesting, attractive, gives us a fresh passion for life. And here's a quote from that book. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least the risk of tragedy, is, at the end of the day, damnation. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. Quite a powerful quote. Well, here's the meat of our argument, our discussion on a good God and the problem of suffering. A good, all-powerful God amidst suffering. The argument against God and the dilemma for faith. The argument against belief amidst suffering goes like this. And the major proponents would be Bertrand Russell, several atheists down through the centuries, and especially highlighted by the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, etc. So here's how it goes. 1. A God who is good and loving would not want suffering and evil to exist. A God who is all-powerful could remove all suffering and evil. Therefore, if God is good and all-powerful, there would be no suffering or evil. But suffering and evil continue in the world for all to see and experience. Therefore, such a God must not exist, and we have no hope but to survive suffering and evil on our own. An often asked question is, where is God when it hurts so much, when my child is dying from cancer? Or comedian, filmmaker Woody Allen would say, either God is dead or he's gone on a very long vacation. But there is a fatal flaw to this argument. What's missing? Well, actually, God would not have to do away with evil and suffering immediately. A God-shaped universe does not rule out the possibility of suffering amidst human freedom. It's, at the end of the day, a great but tragically fallen world. The argument, in a sense, ignores the grace and mercy of God that allows us and his whole creation to continue amidst our brokenness, pride, selfishness, and injustice, with the long-term goal of redeeming us without destroying us. This allows opportunity to heal us, show his power and compassion to a fallen world. We humans have potential for both good and evil, as we all know if we're honest in our honest moments. Our brilliance, compassion, and creativity are mixed with deceit, selfishness, and utter cruelty. So symbolically, I guess you could say we are both Beethoven and Eichmann, Gandhi and Hitler, Einstein and Dr. Mengele, Mother Teresa and Pol Pot. The hope of the Christian message is this: God became man in Jesus Christ, taking upon himself the cumulative evil and suffering of the world. No human anywhere could possibly fathom this. Jesus died to resolve the pain and suffering, the pain and evil in the world. This, at the end of the day, is the most profound, loving, redemptive act in human history. That is, God himself experienced the problem of evil and suffering more deeply than any of us could imagine. He knows our pain intimately. This quote from writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the Gulag Archipelago speaks loudly on this topic. It was only when I lay there on the rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, not between political parties, but through every heart, through all human hearts. So I guess Solzhenitsyn is admitting, as he's discovering himself spiritually, we have found the enemy in this matter of suffering, and the enemy is us. We are the problem of evil, the problem of much of our own suffering. But on the positive side, there is hope and joy embedded in suffering. And I wanted to highlight that as well. So in this perspective, within this outlook, this worldview of Christian theism, suffering now indicates that we desperately need the God of Christianity. We get rid of him at our peril. Jesus, in his life, death, and resurrection, reveals both the mystery and the meaning of redemptive suffering. If such a God does not exist, we would have to invent him. We need such transcendent patience, grace, and mercy, such redemptive love to set us free and make us whole. Suffering, actually, at the end of the day, offers an apologetic for Christianity, if understood rightly. Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, a Cambridge PhD grad, says this in her book, Confronting Christianity. It's about 12 tough questions about the Christian faith. Suffering is not an embarrassment to the Christian faith. It is the thread with which Christ's name is stitched into our lives. The Jesus of the New Testament was unafraid to confront human suffering, evil, and death. He responded to it with compassion and healing, challenging the oppressive Pharisees of the time. He went through death to resurrection, not around it. His whole ministry was one of both revelation of God's character and redemption of humans and culture. He said, I am the resurrection and the life, at the tomb of Lazarus. He followed the path of suffering love through to the bitter end. So in light of the resurrection, death has been defeated and joy is our ultimate destiny. We'll talk more about that. So back to the question of worldviews, Boston College philosopher, Peter Kreeft says he has concerns about atheism, secular humanism, or exclusive humanism, as it might be called. However hard evil and suffering are to accept, justify, explain, and endure, atheism is worse. Atheists, although often nice people, tend to shoot themselves in the foot through self-contradictions. Nor can they explain the ultimate evil, death. So he lists some of the questions, some of the points of contention in atheism, materialism, or naturalism. And I refer you to this one excellent philosopher, David Bentley Hart, in his book, The Experience of God, where he talks about science and atheism or naturalism. So here are some of the points that are made. Atheism leads to cold nihilism, meaning that life is essentially without gravity and purpose. It cheapens the world and cheapens us as well. It fails to explain the good in the world, its source, or the inherent value of human beings. Atheism is fatalistic, claiming no higher or redemptive purpose in suffering. There's no comfort at the bedside of a dying friend, no solace, no noble possibility. It seems we are destined to be the stuff of worms, as many have quoted. Atheism is philosophically, empirically, morally, emotionally, and spiritually suicidal. It cannot be lived consistently. Again, the issue of contradictions, self-contradictions. It offers weak answers to the great arguments for God throughout history. See the Plantinga Project, edited by Jerry Wallace and Trent Dougherty, 24 or so arguments for God. This is the best, philosophy available. I think it's true that as I've reflected on this, at the end of the day, most of us really don't respect the God of the atheists. He is more of a caricature of the Lord of hosts, a weak God, a pathetic God. But let's dig deeper into the question of suffering. And I think we have to go through the cross and the death of Jesus in order to do that, to go to fathom its depths. The cross reveals deep truths about suffering. Our God has wounds, as Isaiah 53 said. No other God in the history of mankind has wounds. Our God radically identifies with our suffering. Weakness is turned to strength. His wounds are a cosmic sign of the most profound, life-changing, world-transforming agape love. You can see this articulated masterfully by this Oxford scholar, Larry Siedentop, in the book, Inventing the Individual. Heaven and earth overlap in Jesus, and this really allows us to have an epiphany. Our grief can lead to an epiphany. It can be a conduit, create a bond of love, connect us to God, bind us to one another. Suffering brings new life and hope that sin has been conquered. Great redemption requires great risk and sacrifice. Things like truth-telling, listening, forgiveness, and reconciliation. South African leaders Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela understood this as they articulated it through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So God is interested in redeeming our suffering world right now, and through us, we have a mandate, the power to change the future. We can do better, shape a more caring and just world. That's a lot, and there's more. But at the same time, we are asking God tough questions about suffering, as Job and his friends and his wife were asking God tough questions. God has some questions for us as well. Job is a good man who suffers terribly in the book of the Bible called Job, but never gives up on faith, never gives up on God, although his friends do. So this offers an opportunity of divine encounter or epiphany, and that's what makes all the difference for Job. So here are some of the things that God would say to us, to the children of Israel, to Job, to people today. I brought you out of slavery, misery, a state with no future. So be grateful. Can you grow your faith through periods of trial and uncertainty? If you can, I will be with you through it all. Know your place in the greater scheme of things, Job. Where were you when I created the cosmos, the landscapes, and all those amazing creatures? The wonder of my creation puts your suffering into perspective. My grace, our relationship, is sufficient for you. Job may not have gotten all the answers to his questions, but he got God in the end. And the scientist and medievalist that has done a masterful job of this topic is Tom McLeish, who was one of our speakers at UBC a few years ago. And I recommend highly his book, Faith and Wisdom in Science, where he compares some of the questions that Job brings forth to the early questions of science. God is saying morality will not save you. You need the moral good and the moral law, of course, but ultimately you need redemption, salvation, divine intervention in order to change you, for you to become a good person. And finally, what will you do about suffering in my world? You have much to discover, recover, and contribute. How will you overcome evil with good? Offer comfort to the broken heart. So at the end of the day, under this category, those who discern the dawn, those who see the light of the new day, awaken the world. One movie I've watched recently with my family is The Boy in Striped Pajamas. It's a beautiful story, a beautiful tragic story about two little boys. One is a Jewish prison camp inmate, and one is the son of the commandant in charge of that prison. And what they can't understand is a world divided. They can't understand why they can't just be friends and play ball together as normal boys would. Recommend this movie, but make sure you bring lots of Kleenex with you. So we're moving towards the human or the emotional side of this subject. At the end of the day, comfort, compassion, and communion is what we want. These are the deepest longings of the heart. You can imagine if you're watching an episode of Grey's Anatomy, somebody is asking, does anybody care? Over here, I need some help. We want solidarity, support, and solutions. Suffering is not just a philosophical problem, but my own powerful experience of pain. It's my own confusion and struggle. Are we being good stewards of our suffering? At the end of the day, that's the question. Secondly, seasons of suffering teach us gratitude, put us in solidarity and sympathy with others who suffer, as we found in the COVID-19 experience, not entirely or across the board, but many people have been brought together in greater solidarity to support one another during this international crisis, where there are many deaths, much suffering. These events, these experiences tenderize our hearts, make us more human. We realize our fallibility and our vulnerability, and it really encourages us that we're more than brains on a stick. Life is sacred and precious. At the end of the day, we need a transcendent frame of reference for discerning the value of each life, each relationship, each tear. And as Amanda Cook sings, God can bring the winter of our lives into spring. We can all choose how to respond to suffering and cruelty, as Viktor Frankl writes in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He discovered this in the death camp itself and saw that some people survived and some people didn't. For instance, he gives the example of one man who gave his last crust of bread to a fellow inmate just before he died, as a sign that he was still human after all. So there was compassion towards fellow prisoners in those camps, even though there was very little compassion from the guards, as you know. So some responded with gratitude, humility, and just generosity, a call to service, as we would see in Mother Teresa in Calcutta, and empathize with others. Others become bitter and sarcastic. I was once talking to a physiotherapist who said there are two very different reactions to people who've had an experience of a severe accident which caused quadriplegia, where they had no control over their limbs or their body. Some become very, very bitter, and some become much better. They become really kind of saintly people. They become really kind and wonderful people to talk to. So that's very true of many people. So at the end of the day, Jesus is the God of truth and comfort, as we see in the Sermon on the Mount. He invites us to become wounded healers, patient lovers of our fellow humans. Jesus himself, in reading when he visited the temple, he read this passage from Isaiah. He said this, that shows how he saw himself, how he saw his identity. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So what Jesus is saying with respect to suffering is, I am in this with you for the long haul. So I want to take a moment out here to read a quote from one of Peter Kreeft's book. It's called Making Sense Out of Suffering, page 136. Love is why he came. It's all love. The buzzing flies around the cross, the stroke of the Roman hammer as nails tear into his screamingly soft flesh, the infinitely harder stroke of his own people's hammering hatred, hammering his heart. Why? For love. God is love, as the sun is fire and light, and he can no more stop loving than the sun can stop shining. Henceforth, when we feel the hammers of life beating on our heads, on our hearts, we must know that he is in here with us, taking our blows. Every tear we shed becomes his tear. He may not yet wipe them away, but he makes them his. Would we rather have our own dry eyes or his tear-filled ones? He came. He is here. This is the salient fact. If he does not heal all our broken bones and loves and lives now, he comes into them and is broken like bread, and we are nourished. And he shows us that we can henceforth use our very brokenness as nourishment for those we love. Since we are his body, We too are the bread that is broken for others. Our very failures help heal other lives. Our very tears help wipe away tears. Our being hated helps those we love. When those we love hang up on us, he keeps the lines open. His witness with us enables us to be with those who refuse to be with us. And another quote from Ann Voskamp, who's really, if you see the trajectory of this talk, it's moving towards, the trajectory is moving towards joy. Joy is the end game. And I really appreciated Ann Voskamp and her work in 1000 Gifts, her appreciation of gratitude and joy. So here's what she says in that book. Humbly let go of trying to do, let go of trying to control, let go of my way, let go of my fears. Let God blow his wind, his trials, oxygen for joy's fire. Leave the hand open and be at peace. Bend the knee and be small and let God give what God chooses to give because he only gives love. Whisper a humble thanks. This is the fuel for joy's flame. Fullness of joy is discovered only in the emptying of will. And I can empty. I can empty because counting his graces has awakened me to how he cherishes me, holds me, passionately values me. I can empty because I am full of his love. I can trust. So here's our discussion in review. Suffering is inescapable for humans. We can get better at facing and processing it, but we must be brave and dig deep, ask for help, including divine help, I suggest. We need a robust worldview to understand its full importance in our lives, to grapple with human suffering, to use our pain to grow and prosper. This takes wisdom, thought, and time. Suffering is not a problem for a good God. Rather, it shows just how much God understands our suffering, identifies with our struggle, and wants to redeem us through it. It reveals his astounding love for us and his genius at bringing good out of evil, healing our brokenness. Suffering, finally, provides us with a great opportunity as wounded healers to build relationships and community, to care for the weak and the homeless, to contribute to a better, more compassionate world. The long game is joy, delight in God himself as he delights in us. A book I'm reading recently is by John Piper, When I Don't Desire God, How to Fight for Joy. He articulates this theme well. And of course, so many need our help. Here's a bit of a bibliography on this topic of suffering and pain and human hurt, and how God is interested in it and what questions people have for God. And there are a couple of talks at the bottom by Alvin Plantinga and Tim Keller. I'll let you take time to look through that. I've listed some practical tips on managing chronic pain, which one can use for counseling or for journaling, or just helping a family member or friend work through their pain. Let's face it, anybody who's dying of pancreatic cancer is experiencing a huge amount of pain, and it's a long-term process to make it through that. Here are some scholarly works on good and evil itself. I've appreciated a number of these great authors, and I think you would as well if you want to dig into it from an academic perspective and go into more depth. And finally, this is one of my books called Mapping the Future, Arenas of Discipleship and Spiritual Direction. We are, at the end of the day, my wife encouraged me that what I was talking about is spiritual direction, listening to people's pain and suffering and helping them work it through, carry it, and process it. So the 30 different territories of discovery in this book, references, resources that I hope will help people to broaden their horizons in this area of spiritual direction. What spirituality really means. Spirituality of the mind, the heart, and the life behavior. It's great for pastors to broaden their reading, and I hope that it's good for changing lives for the better. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you found this helpful material to work through the big question of why do we suffer. Thanks very much.